Okay, colleagues, before we begin our first class on the ancient Greeks, let's take a step back and let's ask ourselves, what is the subject that we are studying? What is this? Political philosophy. So in the most straightforward sense, political philosophy refers to the philosophy of political life. It deals with the foundational questions of politics, of human social arrangements, right? Sociality seems to be an indispensable part of human condition. So naturally, human beings are driven to ask the question as to what is the proper, what is the best possible social arrangement. This is one of the foundational questions of political philosophy in general. What is the best regime? What is the best way to arrange political life? In addition to that, separate but related question, and there are many questions, but let's start with these two, is the nature of obligation and the limits of obligation. The question of why should an individual obey? Why should an individual obey the laws or customs of his or her society, right? What is the nature of this obligation? When is this obligation necessary? And what are the limits of this obligation? So if you want to rephrase this in very simple terms, why should I obey the state? When should I obey the state? And what are the limits of this obedience? Maybe what are the conditions when disobedience is called for, right? You can see in this formulation a deep continuity between political philosophy and moral philosophy. Moral philosophy in general asks the question of what is the good, and political philosophy in this sense deals more with the question of what is the common good, or how does the good of the collectivity relate to the question of individual good, if you want. So in general, I don't want to spend too much time on these definitions because one could easily devote an hour or two to debating the various ways in which different philosophers in the past and today have defined the purpose and task of political philosophy. I think intuitively most students understand what the course in general is going to be about. This is not comprehensive in any way, but as a first pass, it'll do. So we are asking again, philosophy of political life. What is the nature of political life? And specifically, in practical terms, what are the consequences of our understanding of the nature of political life, specifically in terms of individual obedience or disobedience? Okay, more to be said, but let's move on to the second question, which deals with the way we're going to proceed in this course. Courses in political philosophy differ. They're basically, I would say, there are two broad approaches. One is thematic, take issues step by step, and the other one is, if you want, diachronic or historical, chronological approach. We're gonna focus on the second, chronological approach in this course. So it's a good question. Why? So why are we gonna go chronologically, and why are we gonna start basically with more or less the most ancient sources that we can find, at least within the Western tradition, right? So why do we start with the ancient Greeks? So in another way to rephrase this question is, why are we doing political philosophy and let's say not political science, right? You would imagine, presumably, let's say in physics, physicists don't really read Newton, right, today. So why do we read Plato and Aristotle? And there are a couple possible answers. So one possible answer is that actually physicists who think deeply about their discipline definitely do read Newton, or at least they should be familiar with the basic philosophical assumptions of his ideas. So it is not exactly true that other disciplines don't care about their history. They do care, and in mathematics, history of mathematics is also very important. Whenever basically you are talking about the foundations, whenever you are talking about foundational assumptions, right? And actually, if you look at philosophy of science, another course which I teach, you will find that, as a matter of fact, when we look at the hard and fast foundations of disciplines like physics, for example, we don't really see any kind of apodictic knockdown reasons as to why we must proceed in this way or not in some other way. So what I'm driving at is that even physicists don't really deal in truth. Even our best, most secure sciences, even pure mathematics, they are all, in an important sense, foundationless. In the sense that they are mostly rooted in social consensus. Now, of course, philosophers will disagree, and people are constantly trying to find solid foundations. And who knows? Never say never. Maybe physics or mathematics will be put on a secure foundation. However, there are important fundamental reasons to think that this may not really be possible. And certainly, in the 21st century, nobody has been able to convincingly show what those foundations are. Let me just parenthetically note there's a very famous theorem in the foundation of mathematics called Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which very roughly, to oversimplify, says that any kind of logical system that can ground arithmetic will have to contain assumptions that cannot be proven within the system. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's good enough, right? That you always have to rely on assumptions which you yourself cannot prove. And it means that ultimately there's this important element of social consensus, right? So we're talking about assumptions which we cannot prove, therefore we must agree. And it's a social procedure. So you see, we're going to see this attempt to see philosophy and political philosophy as science, right? And here we're doing the reverse. We're trying to see science as a social enterprise, if you want, as a political enterprise, the political consensus foundation of science. So we have assumptions, and these assumptions are really rooted in social consensus, right? In many ways akin to political consensus or aesthetic consensus. Now, what this tells us is that, again, even in physics, we do not have the truth with a capital T. So what do we have instead? We have competing models which have more or less credibility. I mean, let's say in contemporary cosmology, well, we have lambda CDM model, whatever that means, right? But it's not the truth. Physicists have the highest credibility that this is probably the most likely model, but it has problems, and alternatives are definitely pursued. Now, in an important respect, we have to understand that social sciences, from the standpoint of contemporary philosophy of physics, are much more complex than natural sciences. Because, like, if you imagine some sort of a progression, right, we imagine that there's basic physics, and on top of this physics, we build chemistry, and on top of chemistry, maybe we build biology, and on top of biology, we build psychology. Well, actually, let's say psychology, and it's kind of complicated set of disciplines which are related to psychology. Let's say social psychology or political philosophy or politics in general. Maybe let's put economics as a separate sphere here. All of this with a question mark. So we have this progression, and as the levels increase, the complexity increases. Chemistry, on this naturalist view of the world, is more complex than physics. Biology is more complex than chemistry, and I feel that this is a pretty robust picture. So in this sense, it's no surprise that our progress in the social sciences and our consensus in the social sciences is much more precarious, much more controversial than our consensus in the physical sciences. And what this means is that we have paradigms in the physical sciences, but by and large, we operate within what Thomas Kuhn, if you want to read more about this, calls normal science or standard paradigm. And within this standard paradigm, we are doing what Thomas Kuhn calls normal science. We are engaged in problem solving, right? Because we have one dominant paradigm. But as we move up the chain, the dominant paradigm, the consensus gets, if you want, less and less. And once we get to social sciences and sciences of the human mind and human brain, philosophy of, science of consciousness or philosophy of consciousness, science begins to bleed into philosophy. And once we get to social and cognitive sciences, I would say that there's a porous boundary between philosophy on the one hand and science on the other hand. And very importantly for our course, what this means is that we do not have the truth with a capital T. What we have is multiple different perspectives. And these perspectives are in a dialogue with one another. So, presumably, hopefully, if we can dream, we hope that at the end, once we reach the end of history, and humans will finally learn the truth about the world. We will only have one physics, one chemistry, one biology, and one social science. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. At least in our department. If you take other courses in sociology or courses in international relations, you will see different paradigms. Let's say Marxist paradigm, positivist paradigm, post-structuralist or structuralist paradigm, liberal paradigm, realist paradigm, and these paradigms are in dialogue with one another, right? And which one is right? It seems, well, it's hard to say. We don't know which one is right. And I would say preliminarily, sort of not really the conclusion, but like the basic assumption is that maybe these paradigms are all not completely right, but also not completely wrong. That these paradigms or perspectives are complementary, and they all capture something, a certain aspect of reality, right? And in order for the student to understand reality as a whole, you need to compare different paradigms, and then of course there's a big question, problematic question, to what extent does each paradigm accurately describe the world, right? So there's definitely a lot of room for the student then to make up their own mind and to sort of, once you transition from a student to a scholar, you create your own worldview by engaging with these different paradigms. So finally, let's go back to the question with which we began. Why do we start with the Greeks? Because if we think about the whole discipline of social or political philosophy in terms of this dialogue between perspectives, the ancient Greeks, at least within the West, at least chronologically, they begin this dialogue. And all the later traditions that we're going to talk about, even in this course, are going to build on the basic assumptions laid down by the ancient Greeks. And as we go along, I will constantly be referring back to the Greeks. And also, when we talk about the Greeks, I'm going to constantly be referring forward to other philosophers who are going to engage with the Greek legacy. So that's the basic idea. Finally, there's a little bonus. And the bonus is basically that the Greeks are a culture which is distant from us. There's a certain distance between us and the Greeks. And this allows us to step back from the fray, so to speak. Step back from the passions of contemporary political events, right? And regard political life with a bit of a critical distance and with a cool head, if you want, right? The political problems of the ancient Greeks do not occupy us as much. And this, I think, allows for a clearer view. And we talk about clearer view. And in addition to this, we will see, of course, obviously, when you look at other cultures, you see their prejudice very clearly. And when we look at the various prejudices of the ancient Greeks, it will allow us to look at our prejudice more clearly. So this is an extra added bonus, and we'll have a chance to talk about specific examples of this. But hopefully, I've been able to convince you, at least preliminarily, that it's a good idea to start with the Greeks. So, colleagues, in the next segment, let's jump right into it.